And tape's rolling. I got sound. Just say something. Let's make sure we got it. Just say your name.
My name is Abdul.
Yeah, we got it. We got it. All our phones should be off. Or at least on airplane mode. Okay.
My phone is.
Is your purse back here?
Yeah, is there a phone there? Because I think I may. I'm not sure whether it's turned off or not. I think it's turned off.
Here you go.
Because I know that if I don't.
I think this thing is slide down again.
Yeah.
Slide down. Can we pull it back a little bit, give it a little more counterbalance?
You got to move this in closer because of the arm.
You didn't have a problem with it before.
It's what it does is it's too heavy on this end and it's sliding down into the frame.
Oh,
Mics just have a way of finding my mouth.
spoken like a true politician.
Good quotes.
Gotta have fun with it.
Yeah.
You good there?
I got to listen to it. I don't care about
You good?
where it's at. It's okay.
Testing, 1, 2, 3.
Okay.
All right.
We're rolling.
I'm rolling.
And you're going to have them say and spell it first just so we can sound check it.
Okay, what's your name? Please spell it.
All right. Dr. Abdul El Sayed. Abdul El dash capital Sayed.
And you have an MD and doctorate in philosophy.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, you ready?
Yes.
Academic meetings that have people present papers and stuff are a dime a dozen. What's the value of a gathering like this to focus on urban health issues?
Yeah, I think there is a uniting focus for this meeting, which is about transforming and improving health in a particular kind of community with a sense of an appreciation for the past history and context that has led us to this moment and hopefully what we can do afterwards. And so I really appreciated the opportunity to sit with both academics and practitioners and to create the kind of interchange of ideas that I do hope creates momentum and ultimately change as we think about what the challenges facing urban communities is going to be.
Public health, it seems to be changing too, and there's some discussion about that at this meeting. What do you see as the major challenges and opportunities in the field of public health going forward?
So the challenges are going to be engaging in conversations where people external to the field don't necessarily see the input of public health. And as public health has changed and re-emerged as a uniting discipline around the social sciences, humanities, and sciences, I think the relevance to conversations that don't seem quite obvious to people outside of the field is increasing. And so I think the biggest challenge is going to be breaking in the room, making sure that there's a public health frame and active discussion in conversations that have huge implications for public health, even if folks don't appreciate it outside of the field. And I think the opportunity is just that as we're seeing a new urbanism in the United States, and when I say new urbanism, I don't mean to say that urban communities haven't persisted for a very long time, but to say new and renewed focus on cities as the object and focus of social policy, that there's an opportunity for public health to be an important player in how we address both the unique opportunities that this new urbanism offers and also some of the real challenges that it brings with it. Challenges like gentrification and the challenges related to providing the means of a dignified life for everyone and a focus on equity.
I want to talk a little bit about where you're from, Detroit, and some of the choices you've made and some of the problems that we've seen in Michigan. Applying what you just said about the expansive, new, evolving role of public health to things that have happened right there. Obviously, Flint is a place to start. and you were the health commissioner in Detroit and walked away from that to go into politics. So
Yeah.
kind of talk around those issues.
So, public health is what we as a society do collectively to assure conditions within which people can be healthy. I think operatively there, it is about a certain amount of collective action, and it is about what we do with that collective action in places. And as I rebuilt the health department after it was privatized when the city went through bankruptcy and state emergency financial takeover, I realized that there was a distinct limit to what one could accomplish in a moment where public health had been fundamentally decimated and so was so low on the collective agenda. And as a public health physician, I feel like there's not just a responsibility to act on the imperative for public health, but also to move it up on the agenda as a unifying means of thinking about what government should be about doing in the first place. And if we agree that government is about the process by which we make complex decisions about scarce resources to service particular ends in society, I think public health should be at the top of the list. And I found whether it was the very drastic and deeply saddening circumstances of Flint, or the continuing chipping of public health resources at the state level, that there was a responsibility to be able to articulate public health within a broader perspective. And the interesting thing about government is if you speak on one agenda item, then you in effect become ignored because everybody assumes that you're going to speak on that agenda item. And in my case, as a public health physician advocating specifically for public health, there's a way that you get sidelined when folks think that there are bigger issues at play, even if they fail to recognize that actually public health is probably the way that you should be thinking about how to situate all those other issues, whether that be jobs or education or infrastructure or energy, right? All of them play into public health. And if you ask yourself very simply, how do I maximize the opportunities that young people have for the most dignified and healthy life, it'll situate where you should be thinking about all of those other things as well. And so when I realized the difference between how I thought about public health and why public health had to be at the top of an agenda, and most of the politicians around me who, for the most part had been beholden to the same sets of corporate interests for a very long time, thought about public health, I realized that if and when people from my perspective don't stand up and run, we have the circumstance that we've had in Michigan for a very long time. And so decided to leave explicit public health service for public service, with the recognition that I do hope that my experiences as a public health physician will help me to help set an agenda for our state that precludes anything like Flint or anything like Detroit from happening again, because we're thinking more equitably about how we provide basic things like clean air and clean water, how we invest in schools, how we think about the kind of distributed economy that really can empower all kinds of people to have access to it, both as workers, but then also as consumers. And that all comes from a public health frame.
Okie dokie.
Okay,
We good?
that's it?
I think so. I could go on, but I won't, because I know.
Can I ask my question?
Yes, you can ask your question.
It had a little bit to do with Reddit, but you and I had talked about gentrification. So how does moving people in with more of the money and dollar part, how does that impact health?
Yeah.
Yeah, because you move to Reddit, or poor people moving to Reddit, so that impacts the health there. Rich people moving into Center City, does it? How does health fit in? That I can't make that connection.
Yeah.
Make that connection.
The hard part about gentrification.
Okay, that's great, but you need to look at Linda.
Sorry.
Oh,
Okay.
Okay.
So-
Hold it, let's clear, and
The hard thing about gentrification is it's basically the forces of segregation moving backwards, and what you're seeing is an in-migration of people with the socioeconomic trappings of a lot of the opportunities that they've had baked into their families for a very, very long time, and then expanding on a different set of preferences in today's age. And then what you see is that then prices usually communities of color and certainly low-income communities out of those same communities, right, that they've lived in for a very, very long time. And we often focus on housing as the main issue, but it's not just housing. It's also the economic environment that comes with high-income people moving into a community. And then it's also the fact that, that there is a deep set of challenges that I think speaks to some of the historical oppression of communities of color and low-income communities that doesn't actually get talked about, right? That high-income families and white communities have forsaken urban communities for a very, very long time, and then now their children are moving into cities, usually with quite liberal values that would seem to be a lot more inclusive than some of the values that motivated their parents to move out of the cities. But still failing to deal with the fact that there is a deep amount of displacement, there is a deep amount of cultural reappropriation of a particular set of spaces, and a conversation that does not often include the communities who are once again being pushed out or being forsaken in the circumstance of gentrification. So, the reality of it is that we have to have a much bigger conversation about how we push for deep and honest integration, and how we do that in a way that takes into account a lot of the history and a lot of the frustration of communities of color that have both borne the brunt of white flight in the first place, and then now are bearing the brunt of gentrification. My sense is that there is a way forward, but we're missing that opportunity every day. And as these forces continue and young people who were raised in suburbs start moving into cities, day in and day out, we're seeing more and more displacement, and the facts on the ground make it far harder for us to actually promote a set of policies that would allow for the kind of integration that I do hope would benefit everybody in turn. At the end of the day, beyond individuals and beyond communities, there's something about our society right now that has never been more polarized. And I think the opportunity that we have right now to be able to promote a certain amount of honest communal cohabitation could be a very good thing, but we're missing it again.
One last thing following from what you said, and this is something you mentioned earlier. You talked about neoliberalism conceptualizing people as economic throughputs.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean exactly in the context of what you're saying about what's happening to our communities?
We take it for granted that that people should be valued based on their bank accounts, how much they can pull in and how much they can spend, right? And that is economic throughput at the end of the day. And I mean, even if you think about it in the vernacular, when somebody asks how much money somebody has, they say, how much are they worth, right? Which tells you a little bit of something about how we as a society value people and then the different collections of people that exist, communities and neighborhoods and cities. And that framing, that premise is really dangerous when we start asking ourselves how we establish a certain amount of equity, right? And then bake that with a history of racism and racist policies in our country, and you can see that we haven't quite moved away from the same kind of attitudes that created the circumstance that we live in the first place. I think there's a responsibility for us to question that premise, that the way that we should be valuing people, whether that be as economic agents or as people we serve in public service, with that premise in tow, whether we acknowledge it or we don't. And then I think, public servants who believe in a future that is more just, more sustainable, and more equitable have a responsibility to question that premise, to call it out, and to work against it explicitly as we think about who we serve, how we serve them, and what our responsibilities are.
Thank you.
Great, let's sit tight, and we're gonna grab, any more questions at all? All right, and we're just gonna grab room tone, this will be a take on that, and everybody quiet for a few seconds.
communities where race and income would not dictate the kind of life that a young person could lead, right?
Right.
And I think that has a lot to do with place and the idea that anyone could grow up anywhere and have that access to the best, most dignified life. But how we get there, right? And how we address like the baked in wrongs of past social policy is really important. And I think you cannot talk about this without talking about race. But there is also a new reality of the challenges that rural America faces. Because I think a lot of the poverty that we see in rural communities, we don't often pay attention to because it's not as obvious for the gentry, right? Because they don't go out to that part of the state or the part of the country very often. But there's real pain there. And if you just look at life expectancy, the only group who had a falling life expectancy over the past decade has been lower middle income white men. And that says something. And then the other thing politically is that oftentimes what carries political weight is not the experience of a thing, it is the contrast of experiences. It is the contrast of saying, my life used to be better and now it's worse. Right? Which is a very different reality than my life used to be worse and now it's better, even if it's objectively not as good as your now worse life. Do you see what I mean?
Right.
And so as we try and unpack this moment and create a coherent, unifying social policy that can bring us all together and dignify all of our lives, whether it's a 3-year-old girl growing up in a rural community in Michigan or a 3-year-old boy growing up in an urban community in Detroit. The unifying experiences, I think, have to be where we start. And that requires all of us to come together and recognize one another's mutual humanity, which unfortunately in this moment, yeah, exactly, in this moment it's not happening. And that to me is what probably is the scariest thing about the future that we face, is it is so easy right now to look at somebody else and say, you are different than me and hence not deserving of whatever it is I think I deserve. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
Rather than saying, you are a part and parcel of the community in which I live, and my responsibilities to my own young are the same as your responsibility to yours, and my responsibility to yours, and your responsibility to mine. And that loss of collectivism is, I think, the most dangerous ingredient we have right now. And how we solve it is going to dictate the kind of future we can have. And we often forget that it's not, like our futures are already by definition partway gone. You know what I mean?
Right.
It's the young people that we're, bringing into the world and the future that they're building. And unfortunately, when we think about social policy these days, we're seeing sort of a generational selfishness across generations. And we have sort of lost focus as a community that actually the thing we're building toward is the lives of people where we may never touch, right? But this notion that we will always be better. And unfortunately that in a lot of conversations has slipped. So it is a remarkable moment to be an American, and I think it comes with deep responsibility. And I do hope that all of us are willing to bear that, because responsibility comes with work, and work comes with sacrifice. And sacrifice means that you are willing to give of yourself for something that's bigger than you.
Maybe I should go be his press secretary.
You know, I think you
I was the press secretary.
Yeah.
and you were,
I mean, this
Yeah,
is
you
a
should.
hard
What
moment.
you're talking about in your campaign, because it is like, I mean, you got it. You have got it. And I think what is so I'm just so depressed about this. I sit and I listen to these people on the TV, and they talk about this man that's president, and he's terrible. It's true.
Yeah.
But what is really the most painful thing is the fact that the people supposedly on his side, they won't talk to him. They don't address him. They won't call him out. A couple, that guy Connor or whatever, and it's like it's like we're living in like a cartoon or something, where this must be made up because it's so unrealistic in terms of addressing anything that matters to anyone. I mean, it's not addressing the interest of wealthy business people any more than it's addressing the people in Flint. There's no it's like no policy prescriptions, no analysis, nothing.
Yeah. Yeah. I
It's like a ball of confusion.
Yeah. This is that moment. I mean, I like to read history for context of this moment. I'm reading a biography of Grant right now. And, he was sort of the president after Johnson, who was like a completely failed president, but who tried to push Reconstruction and unity in a moment that was really deeply difficult, especially as a symbolic. He was the general of the Union Army. The steady, moderating, communally oriented leadership, and he had his flaws. But the ability to always conceptualize different factions as we, I think, is what we need right now. And the challenge that we have right now is it's just because of the nature of the way that we all consume information and the fact that we've never been more polarized or segregated, at least psychologically segregated, than we are right now. Is that there's a certain courage of being able to reach across and say, hey, I know you're hurting. And I know that the decisions that you made in your moment of pain, I disagree with, and you might even disagree with, but it does not change the way that I value you. And I think that there is a certain loss in that, in our public conversation. And I see it on both sides.
I'm reading one of the books written about Hillary's campaign called Shattered.
Yeah.
And I just read something last night where they referred to her. There was many things wrong with that campaign and many flaws in the candidate, no question about that. But they said that she was not comfortable. A lot of times politicians start to use sort of a royal we, and then, it makes sense to talk about we if you're talking about you and me, that's we. And she didn't do that. Hillary tended not to say we. It was I and you. And I think that capacity to say we, and I don't think we hear that too much from our president now, except as the royal we.
Yeah, I'm traveling all over the state of Michigan, and in many rooms, I'm the only Muslim anybody's ever met. I'll talk about the we of Michigan, and I'll have folks be like, well, I'm not a part of your we. You represent a different thing than I do. I was like, well,
you're from down there in Detroit.
Exactly. And I was like, well, that might be true in your mind, but in my mind, if I'm elected, I'm going to have to govern for you. And I always say that, like, I will judge my leadership based on not just what the people who voted for me said about me and my leadership, but also the person who would never have supported me and may even hate me because of what I demographically am. And my job is to be able to lead for that person too, and almost force that person to reckon with the fact that after 4 to 8 years of my leadership, whether or not they hated me or loved me, that their lives were a little bit better because of the policies that we pushed through. And there's a certain statesmanship that I hope we can start appealing to again, rather than just the chippy, Twitter-oriented conversations that don't do anything but force us into our own little echo chambers. So
140 characters.
Right, because every idea
fits that way.
Exactly.
Thanks
Thank you for the time.
again.
Really appreciate it.
Take care and all the best.
Thank you. Good luck.
See you tomorrow.
Yep.